So welcome to panel 4. For those who are just joining us, welcome to the conference. For those who come from the academic sessions, also welcome to you. And I'm looking forward to continue the discussion with you. So as I said, we are kicking off this part of the conference with panel 4. And the main question we're asking here is, how can new technologies and innovative tools strengthen policy solutions? Our speakers today, in my mind, represent two groups. On the one hand, we have those who are very active and at the forefront of policymaking. And on the other hand, we have those that are active in developing technology, in implementing technology, and in seeing how this works in practice. And the aim for this panel really is to bring these two groups, if we can think of them in terms of two groups, because there's obviously a lot of overlap, to bring these two groups together in a dialogue and to see what emerges from that and how we can contribute to better, more effective policy solutions that pay tribute to innovation and technology. My name is Katharina Höne. I'm the Director of Research at Diplo Foundation, and I really have the pleasure to moderate this panel today. Let me briefly introduce our speakers for today in alphabetical order. I won't do justice to their very rich experiences and accomplishments. So I'm just going to be very brief, and you can check their background and their short biographical notes on the website. So let me introduce them in alphabetical order. We have Professor Joanna Bryson with us, who is Professor of Ethics and Technology at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. Dr. Benjamin Chen, who is Assistant Professor at the University of Hong Kong, and also a research affiliate at ETH Zurich. We have Professor Marc Gruber, who is the Chair of Entrepreneurship and Technology Commercialization at EPFL. Dr. Fadi Makki, who is the founder of Nudge Lebanon and currently heads B for Development, which is the first behavioral insight and nudge unit in the Middle East. We have with us Karine Perset. She's the head of unit of the Artificial Intelligence Policy Observatory at the OECD. And last but not least, Aleksandr Tiulkanov, who is the special advisor on digital development at the Council of Europe. So you can see a lot of experience assembled in this panel, and I'm very keen to get into the discussion with the panelists. I will now be switching to first name basis for our conversation. I hope this is all right with all of the panelists. And also, let me remind you, our audience, that we're looking for your comments and questions, because we're trying to make this as interactive as possible. Each of our panelists could speak on this topic for hours and hours and hours, and we would be very happy to listen to them. But this is really about creating a dialogue among our panelists, but also with you, our audience. I have my colleague Natasha Perutica with me, who will be very closely monitoring the comments and questions that are coming in the chat here, as well as where we are streaming this event. But without further ado, because I realize we've already talked for quite a bit, we want to get into the substance now. So I want to jump in with my first question for Karine. And here we're kind of turning to the OECD AI Policy Observatory. Part of the aim of the observatory is to bring policy, technical, and business experts in AI together to discuss, for example, the OECD principles on trustworthy AI. At the moment, the OECD is also developing a framework for the classification of AI systems. And here I would really like to hear a little bit more about the experiences of developing this framework, any challenges with providing such a policy tool, and from your perspective, Karine, what are the advantages and opportunities of this framework for the classification of AI systems? So let's get right into it, and over to you, Karine.
It's a pleasure to be here today with you. So I'll dive right into it. As you said, I lead the OECD AI Policy Observatory that we launched early 2020 to help policymakers and others implement the OECD AI principles. And these 10 AI principles were adopted by governments from OECD, G20 countries and beyond in the spring of 2019, so over 2 years ago. And they prioritize the most important qualities AI systems should feature, notably that AI systems should benefit people and planet, and embody the values we care about: inclusiveness, privacy, and other human rights, safety, transparency, and importantly, accountability of AI actors for all of this. So the OECD Observatory has two different components that are deeply intertwined. First, the OECD.ai is an online portal that provides resources on everything AI, like real-time trends and data about the AI ecosystem, for example, about AI skills and jobs, AI research, software development, venture capital investments, and much more. It also includes a database of national AI policies, including strategies and regulatory initiatives with over 800 policies from 62 countries. And this is joint work by the OECD and the Commission, the European Commission. And there's much more on the observatory. So that, in addition to being an online portal, the observatory also convenes a network of over 200 experts who are developing guidance for policymakers to implement the OECD AI principles. And the work you asked about on classifying AI systems is one of the group's 4 key focus areas. And so this work on classification is basically about assessing AI systems and applications and the opportunities and risks they raise. And the rationale is that AI is developing really fast in all aspects of society, but there are very many different types of AI systems that do very different things using very different technologies, very different data and processes. Just think about some very different applications like Siri on your phone, or a driverless car, or DeepMind's AlphaFold system that's predicting molecular protein folding patterns. And so these different systems raise really different benefits and challenges. And so the classification work is really an effort to dig a little deeper down one level to develop a user-friendly framework to help assess these different types of AI systems by looking at 4 key dimensions of these systems that we think really reflect their core properties and that raise specific policy considerations. So the framework's first dimension is the context or environment of an AI system. And an AI system in finance or health raises very different policy considerations than one in entertainment. And the context includes other sub-dimensions that include things like how widely the system is deployed, the type of users that interact with it, the degree of choice the users have as to whether or not to use it. So that's the first dimension. And the second dimension, which is the data and input that flow from the context to the AI system. And this is not just data, but it can also be input in the form of rules codified by humans. And this includes criteria like, where did the data come from? Is it dynamic, i.e. does it evolve? Is it structured, semi-structured, or not structured? Are there rights like IP rights attached to the data and an input? And so the framework links these criteria, these variables, to implications for policy. For example, data structure has implications for auditability and explainability. The third dimension is the AI model itself and the technologies that are used in it. So here, for example, a system using a neural network will raise different policy considerations than a symbolic AI system. And so again, we have sub-characteristics that try to capture, that AI model dimension, the building process, inferencing mode, whether there are machine learning models and whether they evolve during operation. So we try to capture all that. And the last dimension is the task and output. And so that's really the output that flows from the AI model back to the context of the system and will influence the context or the environment. And so that really reflects how the system interacts with the world. So for example, is it decision making, content generation, planning, personalization, etc. And again, a decision-making workflow will have very different policy implications than a simple planning workflow of how to get from A to B. So here we consider sub-dimensions like the level of autonomy of the system and others. So just to summarize, the idea is that this framework can help us identify policy considerations for AI systems characterized along those 4 dimensions: context, data and input, AI model, and task and output. And we tested this system with a survey and got a lot of responses. And overall, we're making tweaks, but overall it worked, I'd say, very well. And in most cases. Now, you asked about challenges and opportunities. So starting with the challenges, I think that we've been doing this work in a multi-stakeholder and multidisciplinary group. So there's always the question of speaking the same language and getting to be on the same page, which takes time and discussion and is really, really important. Another significant challenge we've had and actually still have is this tension between developing a framework that is simple and user-friendly enough to be of actual use to policymakers, and then on the other hand, the desire to be complete, to be a bit exhaustive about a system's characteristics, and those are a bit at odds, and we're still trying to navigate that tension. So those are some of the key challenges we've encountered. But then in terms of opportunities, there are many. I think we are now using this framework and its variables to build a risk impact assessment tool for AI applications in cooperation with many experts and with other institutions like Council of Europe, European Commission, and many others. And we're seeing also quite a lot of interest and uptake of the framework. Again, as I said, at the Council of Europe level, the EC level, in sector-specific areas like in medical device and medical testing areas. So those classifications, upgrading those to account for AI being increasingly present in the health sector. And then GPI, for example, the Global Partnership on AI that I think we'll hear about more, has also been using the same framework for its work on AI systems to respond to the pandemic. So those are some of the key opportunities and challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this introduction. I can already see a lot of kind of questions coming to my mind on how to coordinate such an effort, as you said, the multi-stakeholder challenge, but also how to even agree on such a framework and some of the challenges associated with that. So I can see a lot of questions there. You already mentioned a number of other initiatives, and the great thing with this panel is that we have people who can speak on these initiatives or who are very much part and parcel of these initiatives. So I want to continue on exactly that kind of frame, and that brings me to the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence and Professor Joanna Bryson. So the connection between GPAI and OECD, there are many, but for example, the OECD is hosting the GPAI Secretariat. But the way I would like to get into this discussion is basically asking what are some of the recent developments regarding GPAI and what can we expect in the near future, and perhaps also how does it relate to the other initiatives, as Karine already hinted at. So over to you, Joanna, to kind of get us into the conversation on the partnership.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for having me here. I'm really flattered. And also, I would love to be talking about transparency with Karine too. That's actually more my whatever wheelhouse. But in fact, I've been asked to talk about Global Partnership for AI, so I will. It was something that kind of came out of the G7 in some way that I don't entirely know. But I was asked I first heard of it when I was asked by Germany to be one of their 9 nominees. And I've wound up in the working group that works on the responsible use and development of artificial intelligence. So it isn't only G7 countries. So in fact, it was touch or go whether the USA would join it. On the other hand, we have a lot of other countries, including India, Slovenia, Singapore. There's actually 18 countries now, and the EU. So even though there's like EU countries, there's also the EU separately, which is kind of interesting. I've actually learned since all this started that from Wikipedia that some people are talking about the G7 extending with a very similar list. But on the other hand, I think GPA has been really flattered and interested in engaging with the interests of other countries. So for example, Egypt and Turkey have joined. So what is this all about? Good question. And I personally was worried when Politico put out an article right after we kicked off saying it was all about China. If it was all about China, then I think China should be a member. But in fact, what we were told was that it was about trying to sort of get together and discuss the appropriate use and governance of AI between a bunch of like-minded countries, so that we should be cooperating, making it easier to use and deploy AI, and anyway, that was what we were first told. And now there's been a bigger emphasis on sort of the AI for good that I think is this panel name. I'm not sure. I'm going to just rattle off some of the projects so that you can know about them. But I really recommend the video that was made. It's quite short, that was made this summer at the meeting. So to see the details, because these projects are actually amazing. They've put some great partners together. So for example, the Innovation and Commercialization Working Group, their two projects are broad adoption of AI by SMEs and protecting AI innovation and intellectual property. And I know they're doing really interesting, innovative work on intellectual property. The Future of Work panel, I wanted to be on it, but I didn't get it. Oh well. It's the observation platform of AI at the workplace, which sounds kind of boring, but it's really important and interesting about how it is getting actual data about how things are changing, and also working fair work for AI. I think they mean using AI, and I've forgotten the details. Anyway, the data governance is looking at enabling data sharing for social benefit through data trusts. And then also advancing research and practice on data justice. Responsible use and development of AI group. Our thing is a responsible AI strategy for the environment. And the other one that I'm most involved in is responsible AI for social media governance. And that's an initiative coming out of New Zealand. So we're really looking at, again, one of the partner countries, New Zealand, working directly with some of the big companies you've heard of on these problems, and joint with some of the work that, of course, is already happening there through their initiatives in response to their terrorist actions, suffering. And then we also have, as was mentioned by Karine, a special kind of spin out on pandemics that spun out of the Responsible Use and Development of AI Working Group. So I think this tension between whether what we're doing it can even be called governance or regulation, what we're trying to do, we certainly are not supposed to be normative. The countries themselves are the ones who will take the decisions about which policies to use, but we're trying to, and what is even normative? As an academic, I think, of course, we are telling people things that have normative valence. So we're telling them what works in what context. But the individual countries have to decide what their context, what part of their context really matters. That's what it is to govern. And so, of course, the countries get to do that. Now, the EU is a really interesting place because there's this harmonized set of countries that agree in some matters about how they're going to govern and share through treaty rules. But again, the Global Partnership for AI, explicitly in the bylaws, we're not going to create such a harmonized region. So that's not what we're about. We do seem to be about sharing expertise, and I think actually also maybe developing expertise in governments. So trying to bring governments and corporations a little bit more in balance with each other so that they can understand and work with each other. So I think that's one of the big concerns of our group. So far, we're too new. I wouldn't say that we are adequately integrated. I personally am a big fan of the Internet Governance Forum, and I would like to see AI done there. In fact, it was Karine that brought me there the first time, and I was blown away. It was really, really interesting. In fact, I think I was representing the OECD that time. But anyway, there's a respectable project coming out of the G20. UNESCO is doing really great work. And we're trying to do, in fact, our next big meeting is at the same time and location as the Paris Peace Forum. So we're looking to bridge, and I think that's sort of what the digital age is doing. It's interesting because borders still matter. You know what happens to your neighbors still matters. So all these things matter, and governments definitely matter. They're how we coordinate executive force. But at the same time, we can all talk to each other in lots of different ways. And it's not like there's one big leader out there sometimes. So it's an interesting problem because it can lead to entropy and chaos and disruption of the rule of law and some of the things we've seen. But it can also, hopefully, when we get organized about it, lead to a stronger and more resilient governance structure.
Thank you so much. There's a lot here. I want to echo your comment on transparency and how to create transparency. That's certainly something we will come back to in the discussion, but also creating these connections. And let me echo one other thing, which I very much agree on, the Internet Governance Forum as a great place to create these exchanges and with this fundamental ideal of multi-stakeholderism. kind of creating connections and synergies. This brings me directly to the Council of Europe, which also Joanna and Karine, I think, already hinted on, and to you, Aleksandr. So the Council of Europe hosts the Ad Hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and it focuses, in regard to artificial intelligence, it focuses on key principles such as human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And fairness and transparency, we're getting back to the topic of transparency, are important values that need to feature in the design of implementations of AI systems. That's kind of the thrust of the argument and the ideal here. So from that perspective, from the Council of Europe perspective, Aleksandr, what are your expectations with regard to the business sector when we talk about transparency, values, and the implementation of these in AI systems? And perhaps there is this term fair washing. Can you maybe perhaps comment a little bit on this concern when it comes to implementation, or kind of your expectations regarding the business sector? Over to you, Aleksandr.
Thank you, Katharina. So our expectations as the Council of Europe is based on the specifics of the AI systems, in that they are socio-technical systems, as we say in our feasibility study, which was published a year ago almost. So that is the risks which are relevant for the AI systems use depend on how they are designed and used in a broader context. And there are specific other risks related to the how AI systems work, in that, for example, if the either technology or the use is problematic, there is a serious threat of a feedback loop where you, for example, due to the specifics of how machine learning operates, you reinforce bad outcomes. I mean, outcomes which might be bad for the society through the use of these systems. So this is a real risk. And as we understand and as we know, for quite a long time, we should be able to acknowledge that, for example, code regulates, as we know from Lawrence Lessig's works, that is, when he was talking 20 almost years ago on the modalities of regulating human behavior. He mentioned that software or computer code, alongside the social norms and law and market forces, is a way to regulate human behavior. And therefore, it is quite important for us, the Council of Europe, to make sure that the business is aware that as primarily business, the private sector is a purveyor of those systems. There is a great responsibility on the shoulders of the business community to make sure that this ability to regulate, which they are endowed with thanks to the how code operates, what they produce, is, I mean, they need to be very careful how they use that power and instruments. So it's when basically by automated decision making, which is employed then also in the private and the public sector, but originally developed in the private sector, a lot of effects may come up. And in this sense, we might be able to rely upon already existing instruments in engaging what might be like the obligations of the private sector already existing so far. And I would refer, for example, to the our Council of Europe Convention 108 plus on the automated processing of personal data, which already refers to those notions of fairness and transparency, insofar as it provides some obligations for the data controllers, for example. And as we know, automated decision-making as it currently stands always employs the processing of personal data when the algorithms are used to judge a particular person and to create significant legal effects for him or her. And this convention, for example, already provides that there is a right for the person to be not subject to significant automated decision making without his or her views taking into the consideration. This is a fairness aspect, I would say. And also the data subject is already entitled to know the reasoning behind the automated decision making, which might be powered by AI. That is, currently business community is already aware of some requirements which are imposed on them already through the instruments of the Council of Europe, and accordingly the regulation in the member states, which also includes the GDPR in case of the European Union, which roughly is based on the same principles in terms of safeguards provided for the cases of the use of automated decision making, both in the private and public sectors. And I must also stress the necessity of the impact assessments, and this is already provided again in the context of data protection with the data privacy impact assessments, which is a thing under the 108 convention and GDPR, for example, in case of European Union. And the privacy by design and basically, these principles are now being elaborated, or rather, there are considerations within the Council of Europe current body, which oversees the production of potential elements for a transversal convention for AI, in the sense that there are already those principles which are provided for automated decision making in the existing legal instruments, and now we can employ those and develop them further, and the same ideas, for example, not to focus solely on data protection, but rather speak more broadly about how, for example, an impact assessment should be done in terms of when you are faced with certain significant risks. And we might be talking about an impact assessment format which would consider both a threat to human rights, democracy, and the rule of law more broadly. So again, based on the existing principles, but developed in a specific manner, which would be more relevant for AI more and automated decision making more broadly. And this is just like an legal aspect of what we are talking about. But as our panel suggests, that we are also to describe the technological ways to facilitate the goals of the regulation as well. We should also not forget about that there are these tools, technological tools, which help business community, which might help the business community to combat the problems caused by the use of technology. Which, for example, I would give an example of fairness toolkits, which are available, which are open source, and for example, some of you might know about those toolkits, for example, the IBM Fairness Toolkits, or FairLearn, or Equitas tool, or Google What If tool, or some others. I mean, there are a lot of them on the market, but as current research suggests, for example, the Cambridge researchers recently this year have studied this question on the use of these fairness toolkits, which might facilitate combating, for example, unwanted bias in the machine learning systems. And they come up with the results that, for example, according to their survey, only 54% of respondents who supposedly are well equipped with the knowledge of what should be used and what is there on the market, So only 54% knew about the existence and the ease of use of such fairness toolkits, which suggests that the awareness is not really there yet. And I think we should be all concerned about that. And about the, briefly speaking about the fair washing, which you alluded to, this is again a problem. You may remember about the Dieselgate scandal, where, for example, one of the automotive producers fine-tuned their software in such a way that in some situations, for example, in testing situations, the software would show particular parameters, and in the real operating environment, it would operate quite differently. And this is what we exactly now are facing. The same problem of fair washing, which is comparable in the AI, when you take a black box model and try to explain it away post factum with some interpretation, which might appear to be saying that the model, the underlying model is fair, but it is not. And there is research ongoing on this problem. That's when we use black box models for certain uses, this might be a problem for the society, that the developers might not be telling us the truth sometimes. So this is briefly what I would like to underline.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for this introduction. Also, what I would like is highlight especially is the fairness toolkits, and what you also mentioned, that there seems to be, they exist, quite a number of them, as you mentioned, but there seems to be a lack of awareness, and that's really interesting and something we can come back to in the discussion. Also, thank you for alluding to the problem of fair washing. Before we continue with our other speakers, I would like to turn just very quickly to our audience. Just a quick reminder, we're looking for your questions and comments, your critical remarks, your challenging questions, because this is really what we're here for, to try and solve some of these intricate, or try to start speaking about some of these intricate problems, issues, concerns we're having in this debate. We're seeing many great initiatives, but perhaps the question now is, how can we bring all of this together? So looking at you, I have basically a question for you, our audience. What I would like you to do is participate in a little survey. You can see it on the screen now. We're using Mentimeter for this exercise. If you are already familiar with Mentimeter, you know how it works. You go to menti.com, you type in the code that you can see on top here. The code is 6740606. My colleague Natasha Perutica will also be putting this in the chat, so you can simply copy the code. You can also use the direct link. So you go to menti.com, you type in the code or use the direct link, and then we have basically 3 statements for you, and we would like to ask you to rate these statements for us. And it really relates to what we just heard from our first 3 speakers. So the first question, or the first statement we want you to rate, is about synergy. How well do different policy initiatives complement each other? I put here OECD, UNESCO, the Global Partnership. We can widen this, and we should widen this in your mind. Second statement, which is very interesting, because we just heard how businesses might not be up to date regarding fairness tools. Here we're asking, are policymakers perhaps too removed from how the world of business works and the reality of business and implementing AI tools? And then the last statement is around fair washing and the question of whether or not there's a real danger of fair washing. You can already see on the screen, we have the first responses coming in. So I will keep this open, and we come back to this a little bit later after we heard from our other 3 panelists. So keep putting your answers in. We really want to hear from you and get a sense of what your opinion is on these questions, and then we bring that back into the discussion. So it will be open, and I will come back to this later to see the final result. But now, without further ado, let me go to our next speaker, which is Dr. Ben Chen. And Ben, you're doing some really interesting research that for me falls directly in this kind of gap of how does implementation look like and what are the challenges we're encountering in implementation and in practice. So from what I understand, you looked at AI systems and their use in courts. And then in this regard, perceptions around fairness of the potential for AI judges, so how AI judges might be perceived, and the question of fairness in this perception. So from that perspective, what is your kind of view on the challenges and opportunities regarding the implementation of AI systems? And from these case studies you looked at, are there any perhaps lessons learned for policymakers? So over to you, Ben, and I'm really curious to hear more about this research.
Yes, thank you so much. So as a legal scholar, I'm actually very interested in the use of AI in adjudication. And this is research I'm doing with colleagues at ETH Zurich and at Georgetown University. And so when we talk about adjudication, using AI for adjudication, one of the most persistent, strongest objections is the objection from fairness. So people view a machine, view machine adjudication as somehow less procedurally fair than human adjudication. And so this is one of the main challenges, that any kind of proposal has to overcome, any kind of proposal for using AI in adjudication. And when we talk about fairness, there's several ways to think about it. One way to think about it is the doctrinal way, right? Does this conform to legal standards of how we define fairness? Another way to think about it is to be philosophical, right? So what is fairness? Can AI adjudication ever truly be fair? But the way we are thinking about it is actually the way that's most suited actually for a policy audience, which is what do people consider to be fair, right? What are lay judgments about fairness when it comes to AI adjudication? And so we have a paper, as you mentioned, it's available online, but I can summarize it in terms of 3 takeaways. The first takeaway is there is this human AI fairness gap. So consistent with the criticism, we actually do find that when it comes to ordinary citizens, they do view human adjudication as fairer than machine adjudication. And we found this effect to be quite robust. It exists, when we look at, for example, consumer refund scenarios, where it's just a simple case of refunding defective merchandise. And we also find it in cases, for example, like bail, pre-trial bail, or in criminal sentencing, right? So across all these scenarios, people consistently viewed human adjudication as just fairer than machine adjudication. So there are 2 questions, right? What is the cause of this? The other question is, what can we do about it? Should we do anything about it? Now, the first thing, what is the cause of this, is actually quite interesting. So we actually find through mediation analysis, which is a way of kind of correlating people's reported judgments on certain questions with their judgments of fairness. For mediation analysis, we actually find that the human AI advantage doesn't seem to be due to distinctly human factors, which is what I thought at the beginning. So at the outset, I would have thought that the objection was because people feel like a machine cannot truly understand them. A machine doesn't really give them the same kind of fair hearing that a human does. But that's not it, right? What seems to be explaining a lot of the effect, at least that we find in our studies, is actually perceptions of the accuracy and the comprehensiveness of machine adjudicators. So people feel that machines are less fair because they feel that machine rendered judgments are less accurate, that machines take less into account than a human judge would. So that goes to cause, right? And what can we do about it? Should we do anything about it? Well, one very simple answer, right, in terms of what we can do about it is, if machines are indeed more accurate, right, and this kind of human AI fairness gap is being generated by misperception, then giving people information, of course, about the accuracy of machines would be quite helpful in encouraging them to accept, for example, machine adjudication. So that is one thing we could do. But another thing we could do, which comes out of our study, is to implement procedural kind of steps in machine adjudication that may not be available in human adjudication. What do I mean? In our study, we also looked at things like, the interpretability of the decision, and for example, the opportunity for hearing. And we actually find that, a more interpretable decision, for example, increases people's judgments of fairness. Giving people a chance to speak, even to AI, increases their kind of judgments of fairness. And, these effects will vary a lot across humans and machines. And so actually, if you're using a machine adjudicator and you complement the process, for example, with a decision that's interpretable, and I'm happy to discuss, what we mean by that, or, by giving someone a hearing when he or she otherwise would not have had one before a human judge, then that kind of evens out this gap, that kind of closes this gap. Now, last thing I want to say, of course, you can be very Machiavellian about this, right? I mean, you can take these findings and you give people a hearing, but it's a sham hearing. So they feel like they're being heard, but actually nothing's being done with what they're saying. And of course, we do want to caution against that, right? So one way of taking these findings is to be cynical and use it to exploit people's kind of judgments, right? Or the patterns of judgments. But another way to think about it is, if the technology is there, right? If there is technology that can indeed, transcribe speech, and there is, right? And that can kind of process it and feed it into a decision-making process, making that available when, when in the human process, there wouldn't have been such a chance, that could be very useful in terms of allowing people to view a machine adjudicated decision as fair.
Thank you so much. There's a lot to unpack here, and we already saw some reactions in the chat, so thank you. Keep these questions coming. I see from what you just described, which is really interesting, I see some overlap into questions of transparency. But what I find really interesting is that we're essentially talking about how to engineer or how to manage this process of a human-machine interaction. And so you were talking about perceptions, and the other part of this equation is behavior, which brings me to Dr. Fadi Makki and questions around this concept of nudging, which I guess many of us have heard, but perhaps you can explain it very briefly again, just a little bit. So in your work, as I described in the beginning, it's about behavior and kind of accessing behavior on the basis of AI, big data. But can you just explain to us nudging and how it features in your work and with these questions of implementation, transparency, policy in mind?
Thank you very much. That's what I will bring, a completely different perspective, looking at all these problems of technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, but from a behavioral lens. So maybe a brief background about nudging, which has been growing steadily over the last few years, 10 years essentially, since the book Nudge was published by Kat Sunstein and Richard Thaler. Richard Thaler went on to win the Nobel Prize in Economics for his contributions on nudge theory and behavioral economics. And that book and that work on nudge and behavioral economics has inspired many to set up nudge units and behavioral science teams, such as David Cameron, probably one of the most well-known units set up in 2010, one of the earlier ones, and the one set up a bit earlier, but also by President Obama at the White House. So many governments have been doing this. So what is it that we do in nudge? Essentially, all units, behavioral science units, essentially do three things. The first thing is that they dissect the problem and the challenge from a behavioral lens, which allows us a superior understanding of human biases, cognitive limitations. Overall, this improves the predictive power of our assessment. So we understand what makes people tick. We go into the combination of psychology, of behavioral science, all what really drives people to act in a particular way. And the second thing we do in behavioral science is now, because of that superior understanding of kind of the biases, the psychology of people, we can design small choice architecture types of interventions called nudges that factor in those biases. And the nudge, as defined by Kat Sunstein and Richard Thaler, is small choice architecture types of interventions, small changes in the context within which decisions are taken, that gently steers people in the desired direction without forcing them to do it, and while still being cost effective. So a major incentive is not a nudge. A ban that limits choice is also not a nudge. So it's essentially a complementary tool that kind of gets people in the right direction. And the third thing that we do in nudging and behavioral science is basically testing. So basically, we test what works from what does not work, ideally through what we call experimentation and randomized control trial, which is the field kind of which is what we borrow from medical trials and kind of to test medicine and to test drugs. So now many governments are using behavioral science and experimentation, and they do it to maximize social impact, to solve public policy challenges that we tell have behavioral. So it's used to get people to pay their taxes on time or paying their utility bills on time. For example, a lot of nudges use what we call social norms, because we know that when we update people's perception about a certain rule or a norm, it has an impact on how they will act themselves. So especially if the norm that you're relaying to people is a majoritarian norm. That's, for instance, 90% are doing that particular behavior, or 80%, whatever that behavior is. And then that basically gets people to kind of get to herd and do kind of compliance. It has been done in a lot of ways, but there are so many other types of nudges. Default is, of course, one of the very powerful nudges, because it factors in what we know about the cognitive biases. It factors in what we know about bias such as status quo bias, about things that we kind of are procrastinating about. So changing the default can basically put us in a position where we have to opt out when we might not necessarily always opt out. So these nudges, whether social norms, whether gentle reminders, whether default rule, whether an active choice, are sometimes small changes that get us into a kind of certain desired behavior. Now, private sector has been also doing something similar. They've been using marketing to kind of for private and sales purposes, but they've been doing this. They do some kind of experimentation. They do A/B testing, of course, but now it's becoming more and more common for behavioral, for private sector and government and NGOs and academia to use kind of behavioral science to test what works. And now many private sector companies do now recruit very specialized skills and call them behavioral scientists, or chief behavioral scientists, or chief behavioral units and experimentation officer to do exactly this. Now, the same challenges that you have with the ethics of nudge, whether it's kind of pushing people in certain direction and then checking who does these things, whether it's trusted and so on, the same thing can be taken to a multiplier effect when you bring in AI. So basically, when it comes to recent trends, use of large data sets, big data, basically now is a common trend in nudges and basically in artificial intelligence. And basically nudging thrives and experimentation thrives on presence and access to large data sets. So basically we are seeing a move from small pilots that we used to do a few years back to now access to huge data sets, which also, of course, takes nudging and behavioral experiments to new heights, but also comes with its own challenges. So the use of, another trend is the use of advanced computing and algorithms that allow digging into specific profiles of people, that predict what kind of specific strategy work for what people when and where. And these trends really allow us to better dissect those profiles of stakeholders, the user experience, and allow us actually to design the right nudges, smart nudges that match the right techniques, the right individuals, and really could customize a certain kind of nudge to a group of individuals as part of 1,000 and millions of people. So really taking nudge that we used to pilot on a smaller scale to kind of magnificent and scaled up extents. So basically this new behavioral wave combines data, technology, and make nudging and behavioral science even more customized, targeted, and hence more effective.
Thank you so much for this introduction. Again, a lot of questions coming to my mind around transparency, but also the limits of nudging, perhaps, or nudging for good. And I'm going to be really interested to hear the dialogue between the people, our policymakers, so to speak, and kind of your approach. But we have one more speaker that I want to hear first, which is Professor Marc Gruber. Again, a lot of experience that we can draw on. I wanted to ask you about your reflections and experience with some of the projects and initiatives you were pushing and leading. So one of them is the Innovation Park, and the other one is the Market Opportunity Innovator. And again, what lessons have you learned from these experiences? And in particular, with this idea of this interface, policymakers and tech companies. Marc, some experiences from your side, please.
Great to be here, Katharina, and super interesting panel. I really loved hearing the thoughts of my colleagues here. I look at it very much from a university perspective. This is something which as a professor at a tech institutions like ETH Zurich, we are EPFL, one of the two Swiss Federal Institutes of Technology. We are on the one hand in a position to actually move forward machine learning, and so we are part of the culprits why policymakers are challenged with many of these things, because it happens at the computer science departments in particular, but also in other microtechnology departments at universities that we push these frontiers. What I'm particularly concerned about and is the expertise gaps that we are seeing, because technology, not only in AI, machine learning, but in other fields, moves so fast nowadays that the business sectors and the policy makers often cannot maintain the status quo of where things move, and that's, I think, a particular challenge as an educational and a research institution to help the public sector and the private sector actually keep abreast. And I think there universities have a very critical role to play, and one is in education, of course, giving literacy. Literacy is really probably the best term to use here to the students in terms of what we call computational thinking as EPFL, which we introduced as a third pillar next to math and physics in the education of an engineer. The modern engineer, it's not only math and physics, it's computational thinking, so that the individuals we educate, and some of them go into policy making, most of them obviously go into the private sector, have the literacy to understand what's happening, not only through second-hand knowledge, but first-hand acquired expertise. And I think this is instrumental. The second element, and you've been alluding to the Innovation Park that I've been heading as the Vice President for Innovation here at EPFL for the last 4 years. What we're observing there is that we actually have lots of programs that help to bring startups through what we call a valley of death. This is the lack of funding that they have in the initial stages. So there are lots of programs on the policy levels, the cantonal, the regional level, then up to the national and European levels. And if we think that about this, we care so much about the startups making it to the market and then becoming important players in the economic system. I think if we look at the digital transformation that's going on, that is fueled to not a small extent by machine learning and AI. And the many companies that are left behind through that, especially the small ones, and Joanna talked about these programs that she's looking into, and I very much sympathize with that perspective, that we need to take care of the many small and medium-sized enterprises who don't have the ability to actually apply AI. And I think there policymakers have a particular role. We have looked at several dimensions, but this is a particularly important dimension. And I really like to link this to how much policy support is out there for bringing startups to fruition. But I think we have to do the same for the small and medium-sized enterprises who have not the expertise to actually benefit from these tools, because with digitalization moving forward like we see it, they will have competitive disadvantages, and we need to help them in that regard with all kinds of initiatives. The third element, and I know, maybe I can give you a concrete example. I'm on the board of an exciting company called Amplify, and there we are helping actually the smallest of the companies to develop more expertise in their digital marketing, because their online presence, which is all important nowadays, is oftentimes very dissatisfying. And I think helping companies and in this digital transformation, especially the small ones, is one of the imperatives. The third element that I want to mention is what I'm doing in my research is I developed a tool called the Market Opportunity Navigator that allows companies to more systematically see where they can actually create new value creation options for themselves. And I think what we're seeing here is also oftentimes the lack of capabilities, which is partly technology, but partly entrepreneurial capabilities to benefit from AI. And this is, if we put all of these three elements that I just mentioned together, there is a reschooling and a huge educational task that is ahead of universities, of private institutions in this domain. And I think the policymakers understand this. You know, there are policy schemes out there, but I think given the huge effort that it will be required to do a reskilling and the upskilling of employees and family business owners' expertise, I think we are not even there yet. You know, we need to have many more programs that support the broader economy. I leave it at that. I think you know, we are anyway stretching the time, but I am looking forward to an interesting discussion with my colleagues.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's actually time to get into the discussion with our audience. But I wanted to say thank you for bringing this additional point about which companies can actually afford to use AI and to benefit from AI, and how to, so to speak, perhaps level the playing field in order to ensure that not just the really big companies, and this is a trend we've been seeing, benefit from AI applications. So that's a really interesting additional point. I would like to turn to my colleague, Natasha Perucic, who has kept a very keen eye on the chat and the comments and questions there. Natasha, can you give us an impression of what's been happening in the chat and perhaps some of the key questions we should be bringing into the conversation?
Good morning to everyone, and thank you, Kat, for the floor. I must say that the discussion in the chat has been rather lively, and there were some contributions also from our panelists. But given that we are rather short on time, I will try to be as brief as possible. So there was a question from Vanya Škorić for Karine. She asked if the OECD will also include human rights impact assessment as a useful tool for assessing AI systems. She noted that we have not seen it yet in the draft. She also shared information on the work that they are conducting at ECNL on the OECD framework for classifying AI systems, and she noted that they urge any analysis to holistically assess the level of risk and to ask whether the risk can be successfully mitigated or not. On the IGF and AI, Vanya also commented that there is a need to broaden the debate to other fora. For instance, ECNL will host a session at IGF on human rights impact assessment for AI systems. Commenting on the work of the GPAI, Joanna highlighted that GPAI has human rights at its core, and that therefore every one of its projects has to demonstrate how it furthers the OECD AI principles or the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In terms of better understanding between different stakeholders, Atef Ahmed said that global governance could be a tool that could help ensure that different stakeholders involved in policymaking speak the same language. He also reflected on AI and justice, where he added that he's not sure how robot judges can understand that mercy is above justice and justice is above law. His question was answered by Aleksandr, who underlined that machines do not yet have real understanding, comprehension of the notions which are required for serving justice. There was also a comment from Daniel, who noted that an AI Awareness Day could be a reminder for the public and initiate regular discussions on AI. And lastly, there was a question from Ben from Deborah. She asked whether or not there is another aspect which is linked with perception of expertise and competence, i.e. Which are hard human skills. She also had another question for the audience and for the panelists, where she asked if anyone is aware of anyone developing personal AI and personalized algorithms. That would be all from the floor at the moment.
Thank you so much. So we have a couple of specific questions. So perhaps let me start with those. So Karine, do you have any comments on this question of human rights impact assessment in the context of your work?
Yes, human rights are part of the classification framework, but we don't get into very much detail about human rights, although they are a bit quite present throughout, to the extent that human rights are also going to impact well-being and other. But the classification framework itself doesn't go into specific areas in very much detail, and in fact, that's why the reason also why we're working, we're participating in the Council of Europe's work, and vice versa, to make sure that these frameworks are that are complementary, because of course the Council of Europe's work, it goes into human rights into much more detail, and so that's so we include human rights, and we're leveraging the same. We're leveraging actually a lot of resources from the Council of Europe there, just to make sure these are interoperable. But our main focus is not just human rights; it's human rights and more. And in terms of testing at ECNL, you mentioned of the OECD framework. I'd be really interested in a little bit more information on this. I think this is something, it's perfectly timely now, because we've received hundreds of we've had a public consultation phase where we've received many comments on the framework. So we're integrating those comments and making adjustments where needed. And so this is a fabulous time. And then in terms of holistically assessing the level of risk at class, that is work in progress. And so happy to say more, but maybe not right now. Just one other point, since I have the floor, I'd just like to mention a couple projects, because that are relevant to the questions you posed, Katharina, to the floor. And I just wanted to mention two projects, you know, that just because I think they can be relevant. You asked the question about you know, how do different international policy initiatives complement one another, and I just wanted to mention, because it's fresh off the press, is that we launched a platform called globalpolicy.ai yesterday at 4 p.m. and that's a platform that brings together 8 intergovernmental organizations and regional organizations. You know, it's the Council of Europe, the Commission, the Fundamental Rights Agency, the Inter-American Development Bank, OECD, United Nations, UNESCO, and the World Bank. So these are really intergovernmental organizations, because we wanted to start concrete. And so this coalition really is dedicated to trustworthy AI with complementary mandates, and it aggregates these organizations' work on international AI policy, and is a venue that helps us to identify, you know, commonalities, common projects, etc. So that's one I wanted to mention. And the second question, you know, you meant there was a discussion on, you know, concrete tools that exist but that are not necessarily accessible, and so that's another project that we've been working in another group of One AI over the past year and a half, and so we're building actually a catalog of tools that, again, you know, completely open with API, so that anybody can access it, and classifying tools into technical tools for trustworthy AI, you know, including standards, toolkits, software tools, etc. Procedural tools that are more, you know, process-oriented, operational implementation guidance, and then educational tools. So I just wanted to flag those, because they seemed relevant. Thank you. Sorry for taking up more of the time I should have.
No, thank you for giving a broader framework. Then there was a direct question for Ben, so I would also like to hear from him on this question of mercy, perhaps. But then also there was a question alluding to hard human skills in terms of expertise and competency in the judiciary process. Ben, any reflections from you?
Thank you so much. You know, I myself am quite skeptical about the use of AI in education, to be honest. So now I'm taking the opposite position. What's the best that can be said for the use of AI in education? And when I reflect on it, you know, sometimes the criticisms of the use of AI in education are a little unfair. And the reason for that is that we're holding AI to certain ideals, right? We have this picture of idealized justice, and we're saying AI is falling short. But on reflection, I mean, our current system of justice also falls short of the ideal, right? In the cases I know of, for example, in the United States, many bail decisions, they are made in, you know, literally 10 seconds, right? Defendant comes in, oftentimes doesn't have a lawyer, doesn't get to say anything much. The decision's made, and then next one, right? They're basically, you know, factories for producing dispositions. And when we look at what's actually happening, then the idea of using AI as adjudicators isn't that bad, right? The idea isn't that bad because, it's not like the humans are doing much better, right? And even though we have this idea of, having your day in court, the 16, 20-day trial, where you get to kind of put across your point of view, cross-examine witnesses, that's really very rare in the justice system, right? I mean, most of the time, cases are processed so quickly by judges who rely on little more than snap judgment, right? Especially for things like bail, right? And if we, in a sense, compare apples to apples, right? We don't measure AI against some idealized standard of justice. We measure AI adjudicators against what we actually have right now. Then, I would say on behalf of AI, it's not that bad, right? I mean, it doesn't seem like, the humans are getting it right all the time. There's a famous study in law that showed actually that human lawyers were worse at predicting Supreme Court opinions than AI. They polled a bunch of famous law professors, asked them, what do you think the outcomes of these Supreme Court cases are going to be? And this all-star team of law professors lost to a pretty simple machine, actually, not much better than logistic regression. And if that's the case, right, if we think our judges are really underperforming AI, then I think there is a case to be made, right? You could say, oh, on some idealized version of justice, right, AI cannot understand mercy. It cannot truly deliver, justice, but, the truth is, our justice system doesn't most of the time, right? I mean, only for certain defendants, they have the opportunity to go all the way to trial. For most people, they don't get an opportunity. And so then, AI could be somewhat useful. Okay, so this is my apology for AI. Like I said, I'm still a bit of a skeptic, because I was trained as a lawyer. I'm still a bit of a skeptic, but this is the defense I'll make for AI.
Thank you, but I think it reminds us of a very important dichotomy that we're navigating when we implement AI systems, especially in relation to human behavior or with high consequences for human beings. I noticed that Joanna, Professor Bryson, was making a couple of really interesting comments in the chat, but also has questions for other panelists. So Joanna, over to you to bring those questions if you want.
Oh, well, I guess I could, but I actually really wanted to talk about what Ben just said, because I think it's such a great example of what we're all talking about here. Because he said, I was surprised that Ben, and maybe Ben wants to come back, is that you said that you're a skeptic about this, because I think we're all becoming more productive with AI, and we shouldn't be talking about sort of binaries. And there's like good and bad ways to deploy AI and everything, including adjudication. So I think that was sort of what Ben was saying at the end there. Like there's a huge concern about access to justice, and everything from the case that he was making there about these speed court things. They're just not fair, and there's enormous backlogs of and who gets what, and of course then which discriminated against group is more likely to not get to do bail, and all those kinds of problems. The point is that a lot of the law is already algorithmic as it tries to deal with the scale of our society. And when you do use artificial intelligence to implement such algorithmic details, at least you have something you might possibly be able to get at, recognize a flaw, and then escalate it. So if it was built right, it could be a way to really use the humans to handle the things that need to be handled by humans. On the other hand, if obviously in some countries we're seeing it built wrong, and then it's used to just, in fact, some companies build it wrong and then exclude, maybe not even intentionally, some of their customers from being able to say some of the things that they would like to be able to say. So they've lost that capacity to move up the chain when they have a more interesting or difficult problem. So I think it's really, this is very key to the whole thing about the future of work. When we create software that say we make teachers twice as good, that doesn't say anything about whether that means schools are twice as good or there's half as many teachers, right? That's a political decision. And so it's really important to understand that we're talking about governance and we're talking about policy. And to an extent, we're going to start talking about AI, stop talking about AI. It's like talking about writing. It's just going to become the way by which we implement these decisions we make. And that's why I will ask the question back to Karine. But that was why I was unhappy about the idea that a policy would be different if the AI was implemented with neural networks. No, we need to care about how our stuff hits and impacts the people that we're working with. And yes, there may be different ways that a company will use to demonstrate due diligence if they train some machine learning or if they wrote up, symbolic rules about what they're doing. But I don't think the policy should vary. The policy about that you have to show us what you're doing, you have to be responsible for the software you create, just like any other manufactured product. That means responsible for it performing correctly. That also users, owners, operators will have other obligations. But it's just like a car, and we need, the sooner we get to the idea that all software is just like a car, and whether you call it AI or not, it's neither here nor there. I think the better off we'll all be.
Thank you. Actually, on these comments, I would like to hear the reflections from Aleksandr and Fadi. Aleksandr, from your perspective, from the Council of Europe, what Joanna just said, does that resonate with you? Would you echo this? Would you add something? And then after that, for Fadi, I would like to hear how this looks like for you in practice. I mean, one thing Joanna just said, a lot of the law is already algorithmic. Similarly, a lot of, we have already nudging, but when we put this on the scale, on AI, as you mentioned, we have a larger scale. How do you make sure you have some element of responsibility for the impact you're having, or to make sure it's basically, as I said before, nudging for good? What are your reflections on that? First, Aleksandr, and then Fadi, please. Aleksandr.
The problem is I'm a little bit now mixing your latest comments with what exactly I was supposed to give my say on. So if you could maybe summarize, because...
So, well, if I may, Joanna was kind of saying we need the same rules across the board, no matter what application we're actually talking about, and not kind of make rules specific to the application. Is that, and build on existing rules? Is that a fair summary?
It might be. It might be a fair summary, and to my mind, for example, if we are talking about, I will make one example. So we were talking about, for example, the right to know what has been the algorithmic decisions based upon, the right to explanation. So we can think about is the right to explanation of a particular decision in a particular context taken by a human? If there is a legal requirement to disclose, to provide an explanation, and of course, irrespective of whether this decision then will be taken with the help of AI or not, so if there is a requirement, there should be an explanation. If perhaps the decision is trivial, is not very significant, and there is no so far legal requirement to disclose in similar circumstances what the human was deciding and on what basis, then if we apply AI, it doesn't matter really, because I mean it means that on the basis of this particular situation or particular context, the legislator decided that there should be no need to explain, and it doesn't matter whether the human decides or a machine.
Thank you. So Fadi, directly over to you from this kind of implementation practice and nudging perspective.
Yeah, so this is a serious concern. So while in governments and NGOs and academia, it's kind of understood that when you carry out experiments, it's for good, it's for social impact. It's not the same when it comes to private sector. It's not always the same. Some private sector entities do have a kind of social impact concern, but not always so. So how do we handle that? You will never be able to prevent use of behavioral science and experimentation now. I mean, it's gone. It's already started, and it's increasing with AI. The only thing we could work on is try to kind of be more transparent on those that are misusing behavioral science, using sludges, using kind of making it more difficult to attain the certain behavior. I hear of certain initiatives that try to make nudging when it's targeting children kind of prohibited. I don't see that practical. It's going to be very difficult. So the only option to really work on this is get more voluntary self-restrictions, get into more ethical reviews, peer reviews, and get into more regulation of the data that is used. So that is probably the only way now that kind of the ship has sailed and behavioral science is going to be growing, and the more you attach artificial intelligence to it, it's going to possibly create more good, but the misuse will have a multiplier effect of creating more bad and then creating kind of more negative impact. So we need to look more at the regulation of the data and the misuse of the data and transparency, confidentiality, and then kind of that is probably one way of looking at this.
Thank you. What I perhaps want to add, if you look at the proposed AI regulation from the EU, that goes in a very different direction from what you just said. So it's really interesting to see how this is actually gonna play out. And we only have a few minutes left. So one very important thing that I wanted to do is to share the results from our survey. So if you remember, we had 3 statements, one on synergies, and actually there is an agreement that the different initiatives complement each other quite well. Then there's also slight agreement that policymakers perhaps need to do more to understand the reality of those implementing AI systems. And then we also have a slight agreement on fair washing. It's not very decisive, I must say, but perhaps that is to be expected. We had 20 responses, so thank you for that. Since we only have a few minutes left, perhaps I would like to give everyone the floor for a final comment, a final reflection on the discussion we just had. As always, this discussion is a starting point, and I think there's a lot to kind of take from here and look into further. So just a quick final word from each of you, perhaps even in the form of a tweet or something that could potentially be tweeted. This is the digital world. I would like to go in the same order as we started this conversation. So this brings me to Karine.
This is hard. There's so much, but I maybe just a couple of things I'd highlight are, the importance of building the evidence base, of continuing all of our efforts to work together between different stakeholder communities, between different organizations, and then also, in addition to the evidence base, which is going to be evidence about, the present and the past, working, focusing on foresight exercises so that we have, so that we can better see those risks that are looming, and that, some technologists are going to be able to foresee, but that might not yet be widespread common knowledge among policymakers, but they need to anticipate. So thank you.
Thank you. Final words from you, Joanna, perhaps again in tweetable format, if you can.
Well, sorry, I unmuted myself and then you two, and it was confusing. Anyway, yeah, no, it's been a great panel. The question I still have, which I think is that we haven't brought up enough, is the whole relationship. I think governments are essential. I'm really glad to do something that helps strengthen the cooperation between governments, so governments can keep improving themselves. But we have seen governments be corrupted, even in leading democracies. And so we do need to look at what's happening with respect to some of these efforts being put together sometimes by really large companies, which I think have probably been allowed to become too large. But still, they're the ones who are actually doing things like some of this nudging. And they're doing it in the open. They have companies and everything set up to do it. And yet I'm not sure there's adequate oversight yet. So I have hope, but I just, there's work to be done. And you guys are doing it by running this conference, so thank you.
There's definitely work to be done. Aleksandr, your quick final word.
It was very interesting and informative, and I would thank all the panelists for this interesting dialogue that we have.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't agree more. And Ben, from your perspective, any reflections?
Thank you. This was very fun, and I really enjoyed seeing the comments. I didn't get to respond to each one of them, but I'll just say the following. Legally trained elites, they tend to think that AI justice is bad justice or no justice at all. But I think sometimes it's important to also ask the people who are subject to the process, right? And I don't think their views are determinative, but at least I think their views are sometimes quite illuminating.
Thank you so much. Fadi, any final words from your side?
Yeah, just two quick things. One is that just like our minds are prone to biases, so is artificial intelligence and machine learning. So luckily, however, we could treat that, we could diagnose that, and then do something about understanding what these biases and correct them, because the multiplier effect when it goes wrong is frightening. The next thing I would like to always end with, which is always remember to nudge for good. This is a tool that is made to create social impact. It can be misused. We should try hard and hard to prevent others from misusing it, but nudge for good.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, Marc, your final reflection.
Here's my tweet. I'm not sure if it's 144 characters. Let's, with strong force, address the expertise gaps in small and medium-sized enterprises when it comes to machine learning, because they are the backbone of the economy.
Thank you so much. We had 6 wise and very appreciative final words. I can only echo the appreciation part. It was an absolute pleasure to moderate this panel. Also, thank you to our audience for all the comments and questions. We really got into a discussion, and I really hope we can continue this discussion and discussions like this in the future.